Russia's war began with the promise of a historic triumph. Kyiv would fall. Ukraine would be denazified. NATO would be pushed back. Russia would rise again as a feared empire. That was the emotional contract Putin sold to his own people. But 4 years later, Ukraine still exists. Russia has lost hundreds of thousands of men, burned through mountains of money and weapons, endured sanctions, and watched Ukraine drones strike deep inside its own territory. The great victory never came. So now, Putin has a different problem. How to sell failure as victory? He cannot simply stop and say, this was a disaster. He has to persuade ordinary Russians, the elites around him, the Ultrapatriots he himself inflamed, and the veterans he sent to fight, that the outcome they are left with was the goal all along. I am Elvira Bary, a writer born in the Soviet Union, and today I want to show you how the Kremlin may try to manufacture a fake victory out of a war that failed to deliver what Putin promised. Here's our roadmap. The victory problem. Why Putin cannot simply stop the war. Victory against whom? How the enemy shifts from Ukraine to the collective West. The Ultrapatriot Problem. Why yesterday's loudest war supporters may become tomorrow's extremists. The Veteran Channel. How the Kremlin will try to absorb soldiers' anger. The Peace Thaw. How relief can be sold as Putin's personal gift. The new victory myth. How scraps of failure become symbols of greatness. The fight inside the system. Why this exit script reveals weakness, not confidence. If you'd like to keep getting this kind of deep dive analysis, please subscribe, like, and share. You can also join my think tank, support through PayPal or Super Thanks, or tap Hype Points. And if you are listening on Spotify, follow the show there too. It really helps. The victory problem. Putin's problem today is how to stop without admitting what the war has become. According to the Dossier Center, people inside Russia's presidential administration began working in early 2026 on what they called an image of victory. Not victory itself, but an image. That word matters. The Kremlin knows the war is taking its toll. Resources are running down. Drone strikes are reaching deeper into Russian territory. The country, which already struggled with low birth rates, is losing a lot of young men. And yet Putin cannot simply go on television and say, we failed. He cannot say that because the war was sold as destiny. The invasion was presented as a historic correction, a rescue mission, a sacred defense of Russia against NATO, Nazis, and Western decadence. If the ending is only a frozen line plus some occupied land, then the original promise looks absurd. So the promise has to be edited. At the beginning, that promise was huge. Kyiv, the whole of Ukraine, regime change, denazification, a new European order. Russia as the power that tells everyone else where to stand. Now, it is already smaller, much smaller. For ordinary Russians, the Kremlin's task is to paint an emotionally compelling picture. People need to feel that their suffering had meaning, that their sons did not die for a patch of ruined villages no one can find on a map, that inflation, fear, censorship, and isolation were not the price of one man's obsession. For the elites, the task is different. They need proof that Putin still protects the system, that sanctions and war spending will not swallow everything they build around him. Both of these boil down to the same thing. Putin must remain the man who was right. That is why the end of the war, if it comes, will not be presented as exhaustion. It will be presented as wisdom. Putin knew when to start, and Putin knew when to stop. He could finish Ukraine off, but took pity on its people. He decided not to start a nuclear war that would end the world as we know it. Victory against whom? If the war was against Ukraine, the result is hard to sell. Ukraine still stands. Zelensky remains president. The Ukrainian army is still fighting, pushing back at the front lines and sending drones deep into Russian territory. Russia does not fully control even the regions it formally claimed to annex. So the Kremlin has to move the target. The war was not really against Ukraine, it will say. Ukraine was only the battlefield. The true enemy was always the collective West. This is a smart trick. If Russia fought Ukraine and failed to conquer it, the war looks like humiliation. A nuclear empire failed to crush a neighboring country it once dismissed as artificial. But if Russia fought the West and survived, then survival itself becomes victory. The CIA reports that one of the main planned theses is that Putin banned the West. The idea is to say Russia disrupted Western plans to expand and prolong the conflict. That solves several propaganda problems at once. First, it explains why the war lasted so long. Russia was not stuck. Russia was fighting NATO, America, and Europe at once. Second, it explains why Russia suffered so much. Losses are easier to justify if the enemy is much stronger than you. Third, it explains why their regional goals disappeared. Kyiv, no longer necessary. Zelensky staying in power, a detail. Sanctions, proof the West is angry because it lost. We have seen this shift for years. Russian officials and propagandists kept saying they were not really fighting Ukraine. They were fighting NATO. Ukraine was a puppet, a proxy, a territory used by others. That line was useful during the war. It will be even more useful after it because it removes Ukrainian agency. If Ukrainians are real political actors, then Russia's failure is obvious. Millions of people chose resistance. They defended their country. They paid a terrible price, but they did not accept Moscow's rule. That fact is unbearable for Putin's story. So Ukraine must be reduced to a stage, and the West must become the real actor. Then the story can be shaped like this. Russia stood alone. The West wanted to destroy it. The West poured in weapons, money, sanctions, advisors, and propaganda. And yet, Russia forced everyone to negotiate and make peace. This is why negotiations themselves can become part of the victory myth. They show Putin is still treated as someone the world must speak to. For the Russian elite, that matters more than any village in Donetsk region. The elite does not need a clear military victory. It needs confirmation that the boss still has access to the global table, that he can still bargain with America. In this script, Ukraine becomes almost invisible. The original promise to remake Ukraine quietly disappears. Instead, the audience receives a larger, bigger victory. Russia resisted the West and remained standing. The Ultrapatriot Problem. For years, Russian state television, telegram channels, military bloggers, war correspondents, and patriotic influencers pushed the country deeper into the war mood. They demanded more strikes on Ukraine, more men mobilized, stricter punishments for deserters and traitors, more blood. At the time, this was useful. The Kremlin needed an angry public choir that could shame doubters, attack liberals, insult anyone calling for peace, and make cruelty sound like moral strength. But if the war has to be frozen, this same crowd becomes dangerous. The Kremlin's political managers understand this problem. In their internal plan, the Z community is treated as one of the hardest audiences to manage. These people looked forward to a total victory, a crushed Ukraine, a frightened West, and a Russia that finally returned as empire. Now, they will have to applaud a much smaller result. The Kremlin's new line would sound something like this. True patriots know when to stop. A real statesman does not chase illusions. Russia has already achieved the main goals. To keep going endlessly would be irresponsible. It could turn into a Pyrrhic victory. Very elegant. Yesterday, the person calling for peace was a traitor. Tomorrow, the person demanding endless war may become a reckless extremist. The state decides which emotion is patriotic today. And the people who cannot switch fast enough will discover a painful truth. Loyalty to war is not the same as loyalty to Putin. This is already visible. Pro-war bloggers have become more difficult for the Kremlin to manage because they sometimes criticize corruption, military incompetence, bad command, lack of supplies, and the gap between television triumph and battlefield reality. Russia's pro-war loyalists are already facing repression, including foreign agent labels and extremism charges. War correspondents and Z writers organize audiences, collect aid, and speak about real problems in the army. And that's exactly what the Kremlin fears. Independent influence. If controlled Z bloggers switch to the new line, they will say Putin saved Russia from exhaustion. Putin took what was necessary. Putin forced the West to negotiate. Putin knows better than software warriors who never carried responsibility for the whole country. If uncontrolled voices refuse, the state has tools. And television will explain that they are not patriots, but hysterics who want to bleed Russia dry. The Veteran Channel. Veterans are harder to manage than bloggers because they have a different kind of authority. They were there. They actually fought this war. The regime cannot simply dismiss veterans as hysterical or cowardly. Instead, it has to honor them, contain them, and redirect them. The first step will be to separate good and bad veterans. Good veteran accepts the official victory, joins a party, studies in a state program, opens a business, rebuilds occupied territories, appears on television, speaks to school children, buys a Russian car, thanks the state, and becomes proof that sacrifice was rewarded. Bad veteran drinks, commits crimes, complains too loudly, refuses to adjust, exposes military failures, or asks why the war ended with so little to show. Russia already has the model for this. Putin launched the Time of Heroes program to turn selected war participants into a new loyal elite. Officially, this is about giving veterans a path into public service. Politically, it is about sorting ambitious veterans and attaching them to the system before they become an independent force. That is the key word: selected. Not every veteran becomes elite. Most do not. Most will return to their ordinary lives. But these display cases will become a message the Kremlin sends to the other veterans. Behave correctly, and there is a place for you. Behave incorrectly, and you will be along with your wounds. The Peace Thaw. After years of war, even fear gets tired. People may not protest openly, but exhaustion seeps into daily life. Prices rise. Men vanish into contracts. Artists leave. Friends stop talking. Airports close. Drones fly into Russian regions. Television screams every night that Russia is winning, but somehow the victory never arrives. At some point, the public needs relief. The Kremlin understands this. The planned post-war package includes not only victory slogans, but a whole emotional reset. Roundtables about normalization. Lectures about Russia's positive future after victory. Stories of business success under sanctions. A controlled foreign culture. The return of political humor. Rehabilitation of the word peace. Possibly even a limited amnesty. This sounds like softening, but in truth, it is sedation. The goal is to make society grateful to the same system that froze it. Think of the emotional arc. First, the state says war is necessary. Then, sacrifice is sacred. Then, doubt is betrayal. Then, when the war becomes too heavy, the same state says, now we give you peace. Peace arrives as the ruler's gift, and after that, the regime can loosen a few screws. Maybe some jokes return. Maybe a few cultural figures are allowed back, as long as they repent or keep quiet. Maybe the state allows movies, books, concerts, and entertainment to breathe a little more. But a controlled war is not spring. The regime can melt one corner and freeze another. It will probably keep political prisoners in jail, keep occupied territories militarized, and hold the foreign agent label ready. Broad liberalization remains unlikely. The new victory myth. A real victory does not need much explanation. If Ukraine had surrendered and Russia had installed its own government in Kyiv, the story would have written itself. But that is not what happened. So the Kremlin needs a new victory myth made from pieces. According to the CS Center, the planned package includes territorial gains, natural resources, the land corridor to Crimea, the Azov Sea coast, new Russian-speaking citizens, and the idea that the war cleaned Russia of treacherous elites. Notice the method. Every failure gets wrapped in a symbol. Take the Azov Sea coast. In the new story, it can be presented as a future resort zone. Beaches, hotels, families, children, summer. That image is meant to erase the road that led there. The same happens with the land corridor to Crimea. In military terms, it is one of Russia's few concrete gains. In propaganda terms, it becomes proof of destiny. Crimea is now connected. History is restored. The map has been corrected. And once the map is corrected, the dead can be folded into the story. They did not die because Putin miscalculated. They died so Russia could stand tall. They died so their grandchildren could live under a peaceful sky. That phrase, peaceful sky, is one of the most cynical phrases in Russian political language. It turns the deaths of soldiers into a debt the living must repay with silence. The planned narrative still includes the idea that Ukraine will stop existing within 10 to 15 years. This is useful because it moves victory into the future. If victory is not visible today, it can always be promised for tomorrow. This is an old trick. The Soviet Union promised communism in the future. Putin's Russia promises historical justice in the future. The emotional mechanism is the same. Suffer now, and the meaning will arrive later. The fight inside the system. The leaked presentation does not mean Putin has made a final decision. It shows that political managers inside the presidential administration are preparing for a possible settlement, pause or freeze, and thinking about how to sell it. That distinction matters. In Russia, the political managers and the security men often want the same final result, regime survival, but they prefer different tools. The political managers believe society can be staged. They think in narratives, audiences, emotional arcs, and slogans. For them, the country is a theater. The security men prefer simpler tools: pressure, criminal cases, labels, surveillance, prison. One group says, let's persuade people that this ending is victory. The other says, if they don't accept it, make them afraid to argue. That's how they work together, and the timing makes sense. By May 2026, diplomacy around the war was no longer frozen in the same way. A 3-day ceasefire from May 9 to 11 was announced, with a planned exchange of 1,000 prisoners from each side. At the same time, talks remained difficult, especially over territorial demands and the Donetsk region. So there is movement, but not resolution. The economy also adds pressure. There is a strain in regional budgets, with Russia's combined regional deficit expected to rise in 2026 as war-related payments to volunteers and families are waiting on local finances. The federal budget deficit could widen sharply if oil revenues decline. Ukraine drone attacks have already forced Russia to cut oil output. This is the background to the exit script. Enough pressure that the Kremlin has to ask, if we need to stop or freeze this war, how do we keep the system from seeing it as weakness? The real audience for their narrative is not you or me, not even the average Russian viewer eating dinner in front of the television. The most important audience is the hierarchy itself: governors, ministers, propagandists, security officers, oligarchs, party managers, regional bosses, and military commanders. They need to believe that Putin can still turn events into order, because if they stop believing that, the system begins to wobble. Before you go, I want to ask you something personal. Have you ever watched a leader, a company, or even a family member shrink the original promise and then insist they had achieved exactly what they meant to do all along? If this video helped you understand Russia more clearly, please like, subscribe, and share it with one person who is curious about how authoritarian systems really work. And if you want to keep this channel independent, you can join my think tank, leave a super thanks, support via PayPal, or tap high points to help this episode travel further. And for those listening on Spotify, follow the show so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for watching. See you next time.